You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless.
Welcome to this episode of Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless. Peter, welcome to the studio again.
It's good to be here again, Rick.
Peter, we've been unpacking some interesting stuff over the last few episodes, and where we sort of landed coming out of the last one is that we've decided that if we want to have a best summary of who is God and what is his nature, the statement, God is love, pretty much sums it all up.
Yes.
Okay, so if we accept that premise that God is love, how do we handle the many accounts in Scripture where it appears that God acts in a harsh or an even cruel way? Situations like telling his people to wipe out nations as they enter the Promised Land, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's wife being turned into salt, asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. How do we fit these accounts in with the concept that God is love?
Well, first of all, each of those accounts is a separate item. One of the great difficulties is trying to toss them all into one bag, and you've sort of got a whole lot of bananas, apples, oranges, and grapefruit, and then you're trying to describe all of those fruits with their different characters in one go. So if you don't mind, whilst each of them can be addressed and each of them has a profound lesson, the best way to handle them is to deal with the apples as apples and the bananas as bananas. In other words, we'll deal with one at a time.
Sounds like a good approach.
Now, before we get into that, though, let's have a look at an underlying aspect of the nature of love. Love is an amazing thing. It's incredibly tender, but at the same time, immensely severe. Think of a mother's love for her child. Because she loves the child so much, right, she will be ferocious in dealing with anything that threatens the well-being of that child. And in fact, she'll even be ferocious to the child if the child does something that threatens its own well-being. So love is both tender and severe.
That's true. The picture of a child about to run onto a road and the mother grabs that child by the arm and yanks them back.
And then is very angry with the child for doing such a foolish thing. Now, that's interesting because in many of the scriptures where people speak of the wrath of God, the Greek word there is orge, and it can speak of the intense frustration. A lot of people think of it as his harsh need for revenge. And I think when we do that, we read something into God. We're almost projecting something in God of human failing. Love is a severe thing. Love, to be able to love means you've got to be able to be disappointed. You've got to be able to be frustrated, because things that don't match that love are then things of the source of great pain. And so the word translated wrath does not mean vengeful anger. I don't think there's anything vengeful in God, but God is a God who insists that that for which he created things, they attain, because only in that way can their joy be full. So first of all, therefore from that we learn that love is both beautiful, tender, at times romantic where that's appropriate, but it's always a severe thing. It has a severity to it, and without that severity, then it actually isn't love, right? But the severity is not vengeful, revengeful anger.
It's protective.
It's protective. It's frustration. It can be immensely intense, and the idea of a mother's love to her child is a good way of introducing yourself to that kind of a thought.
You often hear it referred to as like Mama Bear.
Mama Bear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mama Bear will fight to protect the child.
Yep.
So let's take it for instance then. The Israelites are about to cross the river, across the Jordan to go into the Promised Land, and God gives what would seem like a direction for genocide.
Yes, let's call it the command for the genocide of the Canaanites. Now, first of all, that was not a general command that all followers of God had to then apply to all who were unbelievers or who didn't believe in God in any way. It was specific, it was focused on a particular group. And it's interesting, in the passages of Scripture prior to that, God spoke about this, and he spoke about the fact that he was waiting for their iniquity to be full. Iniquity is a word for speaking severe evil, wrongdoing. Their corruption of their culture was so complete it had to be removed. And it's interesting that this fits the pattern, such as, for example, the even more extreme, if you like, genocide reported of the flood, where only Noah survived. Noah and his family survived. Just look at this in terms of a presentation of the character of God. That is, God has his idea of a loving universe that he created. But when that universe, if it turns away from him and its people and human beings turn away from him and become driven in selfishness and lust and all of the passions that are destructive, there comes a time when God says, hey, listen, enough is enough. And I don't think there's any of us who would not at times say, well, listen, this has just got to stop. Enough is enough. We've got to destroy this. We've got to wipe this out. And if you look carefully at the history of the 20th century, which is one of the bloodiest centuries in human history, there's been a huge amount of enough is enough. And the horror of the Second World War in dealing with the scourge of Nazism, we waged total war against them, right? And so that's the reality in which we're in. And so go back to the ancient world, while things might have been on a smaller scale with less technology than the 20th century, people could get to the point of where we might look at the revolting things happening in a society and say enough is enough, this just has to be wiped out.
And the unfortunate thing with those decisions that are made, and as you said, 20th century, we've seen it, we're seeing it even now with Ukraine, Russia, often in that judgment, if you like, or in that, and I'm not talking godly judgment, I'm talking even a human judgment of enough is enough, innocents get hurt.
Yes, yes, innocents get hurt, horribly so. One of the interesting things that archaeologists are discovering over the last centuries is they've actually been digging up some of the places, a place called Ugarit I think it's near Tyre and Sidon, I'm not exactly sure, it's in somewhere in Palestine, in that region. And they've been digging up houses where they're finding the bones of children who were buried under the foundations. Whether they're buried alive or not, we don't know, but they were sacrificed as an offering to the gods so that whoever built the house would prosper. In addition to that, there was a big bronze god called Molech, and Molech was a god that they lit the fire inside this hollow bronze idol with its arms outstretched, and they'd put children alive in, and they would die screaming as they were literally being fried alive in the arms of that god, and that was a Canaanite god. And sadly, the Israelites themselves got caught up in that centuries later. And there was a place called the Valley of Tophet, which was the Valley of Drums. And apparently they used to beat drums to drown out the sound of the screaming children as they died. And there comes a time in our societies when enough is enough. And God acts when things get to that stage. And so that's the lesson to be learned from that scripture. Now, are we afraid of that kind of severity? Yes. Is it distasteful? Yes, in the extreme. Is it horrific? Yes, in the extreme. But is it loving? Well, it's dealing with that which is not love. And it's removing that which is the opposite of love and whose future is only going to be more suffering, more pain. And then when we take a look at the little ones who died, when we look at the mums and the dads who died, then we can say, well, they're in the hands of the one we now know to be an eternal Father. And whatever their eternal destiny is and whatever their eternal future is in the hands of one we can trust.
And I guess we can take some comfort or assure ourselves in the fact that God would have never made that kind of decision lightly. From his character and from what we read in Scripture, there's always a process that has gone through where he's tried to redeem, tried to bring them back before it gets to that point of drawing the line. Yes,
it's interesting. Last time when I spoke to you about love, the description of love in 1 Corinthians 13, it says there, love is long-suffering, and God's love is long-suffering, and God does put up with a lot of stuff that is unloving because he wants to bring redemption and turn our unlovingness into lovingness.
There's a bigger picture view, isn't there? It's like, I guess when God's looking at that whole situation, he's not just seeing Canaan, he's not just seeing Israel, he's seeing the human population as a whole. And it's almost like sometimes you have to amputate a leg to save the person's life. And that's a harsh thing, and that involves loss and it involves pain and suffering. It was actually the right call to make, as hard as it is in the process and as uncomfortable as it is to think about.
Yes, and this is where we come to the realisation that the severe aspect of love is something that needs to be respected. There's a passage that says, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And the love of God is the beginning of wisdom. Both of those are the beginning of wisdom, both fear and love. And people say, well, hang on, doesn't perfect love cast out all fear? Well, yes, in a sense it does, but these are multi-dimensional things. There are different ways of looking at it. In one sense, love casts out all fear, but in another sense, love creates a sense of respectful fear. And I know that many toddlers and infants learn a respectful fear. For the fear of mum is the beginning of wisdom, just as the love of mum is the beginning of wisdom.
And that fear that is talked about in that context, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, is not talking about a terror. It's talking about a respectful awe, an understanding of who you are dealing with.
A deep, respectful attentiveness.
I guess the outtake from that is that we can see all these situations in the Bible. We can see all these other scenarios that I mentioned at the start of the episode. We really have to understand the context of each of those before we pass judgment on God saying, how could you do that?
Yes, and I think rather than reading them judgmentally, and that's not a wrong thing to do, but there's another aspect of the reading we need to apply to say, well, what is it we can learn from this about how the way we ought to live? Should we be the kind of people that sacrifice our children to our ambitions? Should we be the kind of people who lived like the Canaanites did? Or should we be the kind of people who want to live by the law and the life to love our neighbour as ourselves, as was the centre of the law that had been given to the Israelites? And if we're going to live in a society in which we are to love our neighbour as ourselves, to what degree should we tolerate selfish, consuming ambition amongst us? How severe should we be with selfish, consuming ambition that puts other people's lives at risk if we're called to be a people who are to love ourselves, to love our neighbour as ourselves?
And I guess none of us can say that we haven't at some time seen that great news story or a horrific news story about a serial killer or a rapist or something and thought, we draw that line. We draw that enough of is enough statement and say, well, why should that person be allowed either to continue to live or to continue to have freedom?
Yeah, how often do we hear people say, I'm against the death penalty, except in the case of someone like Ivan Milat?
Yeah, we'll find that exception. That's our enough is enough line.
Yes. And even with the proponents of the war in Ukraine, people say, so-and-so should be assassinated, so-and-so should be dealt with. The curious thing is that enough is there in, if not all of us, most of us.
Peter, another great conversation, a deep dive into some tricky areas there and uncomfortable areas, but I think it's all helping us understand better who is God and how does he interact with us as people. So thank you again for your time.
It's a pleasure, Rick.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Karblas is a production of rema.cc.